The marble floors of Dringates never warmed. Bill had learned this in his first week 6 years ago, and the knowledge sat in him now the same way the cold sat in the stone, absorbed, accepted, part of the structure of things. He stood near the base of the main hall at 4:30 in the morning, with his dragonhide boots planted on a seam between two enormous flagstones, watching the last of the chandeliers dim to nothing as the audit team assembled in the dark. There were 11 of them altogether, and Bill was the only one who breathed. He had learned to find a certain comfort in that. In the years he had worked as a curse breaker for Gringotts, he had grown accustomed to the fact that the goblins did not treat his presence at these quarterly sweeps as a privilege. They treated it as a compliance requirement, a clause in the employment charter that stipulated a qualified wizard witness for any scan reaching the 3rd sublevel or below. He was not here because they wanted him here. He was here because the clause said so. Narlak, the audit's head officer, had made this clear during Bill's first sweep and had not bothered to repeat it since, presumably because he considered one clarification sufficient. Bill considered it sufficient, too. He folded his arms and waited, watching Narlak direct the other 10 officers to their starting positions at the mouth of each tunnel. The probity probes were already distributed, 11 of them, 1 per officer, thin silver instruments that hummed at a frequency you felt in your back teeth rather than heard. Bill had been present at 6 previous sweeps. He knew the rhythm of them. The officers would fan out down the tunnels simultaneously, moving at a measured pace, sweeping each probe in slow horizontal arcs at chest height, cataloguing the energy signatures of sealed vault doors as they passed. The hum would build slightly as they went deeper. 3 hours later, they would resurface, and Narlak would dictate findings to a ledger quill, and Bill would sign the witness attestation, and that would be the end of another uneventful quarter. He expected nothing different tonight. Narlak clicked his fingers twice, the signal to begin, and the officers fanned out into the tunnels. The marble hall went quiet, or as quiet as Gringotts ever was, the deep shifts of stone settling against itself, the distant sound of carts on rails far below, the faint cycling of air through the ventilation shafts that Bill had spent 4 months trying not to think about. He settled into his place near the secondary passage and watched Narlak disappear down the central tunnel with the kind of steady, unhurried authority that Bill had spent 3 years trying to understand and had eventually concluded was simply what goblins looked like when they were working. The probes hummed. The stone listened. Bill was 40 minutes into the audit and thinking distantly about breakfast when the hum changed. He almost missed it. He had heard the alarms twice in 6 years, once during a vault seal failure, once during what Narlak had described only as an irregularity, and they were nothing like this. This was quieter. A sustained note threading underneath the probe's regular frequency, the way a second voice appears beneath a melody without competing with it. Clear, held tone, even in pitch, and it made the small hairs on his forearms stand up through his robes. He looked toward the central tunnel. Narlak had stopped walking. He stood 40 feet into the passage with the probe extended before him, his head tilted at a slight angle, perfectly still. 2 officers from the adjacent tunnels were already moving toward him, not hurrying, but with the deliberate convergence of people who had each heard the same thing and understood it. They spoke in low gobbledygook, the consonants close and clipped, in the way that Bill associated with precision rather than urgency. He had spent 6 years learning gobbledygook. He was not fluent. He was functional. He caught, made by our hands. He caught, not here, and then a word he had to pass twice before he was certain. North, north. Something Goblin made, detected by a probe, that should not have been reaching far enough to catch anything outside the building's own perimeter, and the reading was pointing north. Bill stood very still in his section of the hall and did not ask questions. He had learned that too in 6 years. The questions would be answered, or they would not, and the decision was never his to make. He watched Narlak examine the probe's reading with the other 2 officers crowded close, their voices dropping further, and he waited. The second resonance came 11 minutes later. He did not need Gobbledygook for that one. He saw it. Narlak's officer to the east, the one covering the deep vault passage, came up from the lower corridor at a pace that was not quite running but was not walking either. She crossed the hall to Narlak in 7 seconds and spoke 6 words, and Narlak's expression did something Bill had not seen Narlak's expression do in 6 years of quarterly sweeps together, which was go completely still, not neutral. Still the specific stillness of a person confronting something they had not prepared to confront. They conferred. Bill caught almost none of it. The register shifted lower faster. He picked out the word for vault. He picked out the word for deep. He caught a phrase he could not immediately translate. Something about content and wrong inside a right place. And then he heard a word he did know because it was one of the first Gobbledygook words any wizard working in this building learned, the word for contamination, for taint, that came from darkness and did not belong in the earth. Narlak turned and looked at Bill. For a moment, nothing was said. The probe in Narlak's hand had gone silent. The hall was absolutely still. Then Narlak spoke in English, which he did only when he needed to be certain there was no possibility of misunderstanding. "Desecrated," he said. It was not an alarm. It was not an accusation. It was a name, the name for a category of thing that Gringotts had a word for. And that understanding settled into Bill's chest like a stone dropping through still water. A vault in the deep high security level. A contamination that the vault's registered contents could not explain. Something alive and not alive, his mind suggested, because there was only one kind of magical contamination that read that way and carried that name, and he did not want to finish the thought. He did not finish it. Charlak set the probe down. He placed it on the floor with perfect care. The deliberate care of a person making a conscious decision about what to do with their hands. He did not look at it again. Then he looked at Bill, and Bill understood with absolute clarity that whatever had changed in this building in the last 11 minutes, it was not going to change back. "We will need to convene," Narlak said. Bill had heard that phrase once before in a dispute over a cursed amulet that a minor family had stored without proper declaration, and the tone had been exactly this. Not anger, not alarm, but the particular calm of a conclusion already forming. A door swinging shut, that dispute had ended with the family losing their vault permanently, their assets liquidated under Goblin statute, their letter of complaint forwarded to a wizen gamut that had declined to hear it. He did not know what this would end with. He stood in the cold marble quiet of Gringotts at 5:20 in the morning, with the chandeliers still dark above him, and every probe gone silent in every tunnel, and his own red hair tied back since midnight. Coming loose now at the edges, catching a draft from somewhere deep below. Desecrated. Something alive and not alive, kept in the dark in a vault beneath the earth, and the goblins had a word for it. That meant they had seen it before. Narlak had already turned away. He was speaking to the other officers in rapid Gobbledygook, and the officers were listening with the focused attention of people receiving instructions, not information. The decision, Bill understood, had already been made. He was simply the last to know the shape of it. He waited to find out what it was. They did not take Bill to the standard conference level. He had been to the standard conference level a dozen times, a plain chamber, 2 sublevels down, stone walls, a table, no windows because there were never windows, a pair of goblin clerks who offered nothing except the minimum language required to conclude. He knew the passage to it by feel. They went past it. The corridor they entered next was older. Bill could feel it before he could see it. The texture of the air was different, cooler, and somehow denser. And when Nalak held up a lantern, the stonework it illuminated had been dressed by hand in the old way, each seam tight and slightly asymmetric, the kind of work that did not come from a wand. The passage narrowed slightly as it descended. Bill had to duck once. He did not comment on this. The chamber at the end was circular. 7 goblin elders sat at a curved stone table, and the lanterns here were not held but mounted, iron fixtures set into the walls at intervals, burning with a low amber light that had the look of something very old and very deliberate. None of the 7 spoke when Bill entered. They watched him with the patient, measuring attention of people who had already decided to do something and were now assessing whether they had decided correctly. Jarlath spoke in gobbledygook for perhaps 30 seconds. One of the elders, the oldest, Bill thought, or at least the one whose stillness had the most gravity, nodded once. Then she looked at Bill directly and said, in English that was careful and precise, and carried no trace of accommodation, "No wizard has been brought to this level in living memory. We are not agreed that this is correct. We proceed regardless." Bill said nothing. He thought this was the right response. An archivist he had not noticed, standing near the far wall, nearly motionless, came forward. She carried a flat case of dark wood, and she opened it with the particular care of someone who had opened it many times and treated that repetition not as routine, but as obligation. Inside, under a preservation charm that made the air above it shimmer faintly, lay a document. The parchment had gone amber with age, brittle at the edges, and the goblin script across the top was dense and closely worked. Below it, in 2 columns, were 2 different kinds of writing, one that Bill recognized as archaic gobbledygook, and one that was early modern English, the kind used in Muggle contracts from the same period. The date in the upper right corner, in Aramaic numerals, was legible across 2.5 centuries. 1752. The elder who had spoken translated the relevant clause for him. She did it without theatre, reading from her own copy, the words arriving in careful sequence. All objects of goblin craft currently held by wizarding institutions shall be registered within the Goblin Nation's Register of Works within 12 months of this treaty's signing, or shall be deemed unlawfully detained and subject to recovery under goblin law. She set the paper down. "The sword of Gryffindor," she said, "is goblin-made. It was not registered in 1753. It was not registered in any subsequent year." Bill sat with that for a moment. He was good at sitting with things 6 years of working. For people who did not particularly want to explain themselves to him, had been useful training for that. "Where is it now?" he asked Hogwarts. "The headmaster's office." She said it as though this were obvious, which Bill supposed it probably was. "We have known its location for some time." The probo confirmed what the register already told us. The lanterns burned. Somewhere below them, very far down, something moved through stone. In the room of requirement at Hogwarts, Harry Potter was failing to explain the importance of footwork. "The spell's not the problem," he said, for what felt like the 4th time, watching Neville attempt and miss and attempt again. "You're braced wrong before you cast it. You've got to be ready to follow through. Expelliarmus isn't just about the wand coming out. It's about controlling what happens after." He pushed his glasses up, ran a hand through his already disordered black hair, and tried to find a way to say what he meant that didn't sound like something Hermione would say. It always was, during DA sessions. The room of requirement seemed to understand that a group of 15-year-olds practicing combat magic needed both space and the physical comfort of warmth, and it provided both without being asked. Cushions at the edges, bookshelves along one wall, the high vaulted ceiling absorbing the noise of 30 people casting simultaneously. Across the room, Hermione was working with a pair of fourth years, her voice calm and exacting. Ron was sparring with someone from Hufflepuff and losing with more dignity than he usually managed. Harry did not know yet that anything in the world had changed. He was thinking about footwork and about whether Neville would get it before Christmas, and about the dull, persistent ache behind his scar that had been there since breakfast and that he had decided to ignore. He would know soon enough. Back in the deep chamber, Narlac had returned. Bill had not noticed him leave. He was simply not present during the elder's explanation, and then he was present again, standing near the door with the particular stillness that meant he had something to report. He spoke to the elders in gobbledygook for a short time. The eldest made a gesture with one hand that Bill could not read. The second signal, Bill said, the one from within the building, the one that was named Desecrated. The eldest looked at him. She seemed, very briefly, to be deciding something. "You asked," she said, which was not an answer, but was, Bill understood, a kind of acknowledgement. They described it carefully. The vault in question, a high-security deposit belonging to a human family, held, among other things, a cup, gold, old. The cup was not goblin-made. There was no property question. The cup was registered as a personal heirloom of its depositor. Its declared contents raised no concern at the time of deposit, but the probe had read something inside it that the elders had no frame for in wizard terms. They had a frame in their own terms. They described it in gobbledygook first, and then, for Bill's benefit, in English. A concentration of death magic, unlike anything the instruments had measured, outside the aftermath of a battlefield, something that had been made, deliberately, from murder. A fragment of a soul that had been severed from its source. Bill felt queasy. He kept his face still. "A soul fragment," he said. "We do not know the wizard word for what it is," the eldest said. "We know that a depositor brought it into our institution and did not declare it. Every vault in this building is held under terms that prohibit undeclared, harmful magic. This depositor violated those terms." She paused. "The treaty voiding stands on the sword of Gryffindor. Alone the clause is clear. The violation is documented. The sword is sufficient. But this discovery has made us certain that the same people who kept goblin-made work without registering it have also used our house to hide murder magic. We were made complicit without our knowledge or consent." Bill did not say anything. "The council convenes at sunrise," the eldest said. "You may wait, or you may leave. You will not speak of this until after they have met." They showed him out, not unkindly. There was a stone bench in the corridor outside the chamber door, and he sat down on it, and the lantern above him burned its amber light. And he thought about his father, Arthur Weasley, 45 years old, 20 years in the ministry, who had worked alongside the Goblin Liaison Office for as long as Bill could remember, and who did not speak a word of gobbledygook, and who Bill knew with absolute certainty had never been in a corridor this deep or sat in a chamber that old. His father, who loved muggles and enchanted cars and thought the world was, essentially, good, if you gave it enough time and patience. Bill sat on the stone bench in the oldest part of Gringotts and looked at his own hands and thought, this is going to be very bad. He could not have said exactly why he was already certain, only that he was. The owl was not one he recognized, not one of the school owls, not one affiliated with any post office he knew, privately kept and specifically dispatched, which meant someone had chosen a channel they controlled entirely, rather than one the ministry might monitor. He noted this the way he noted most things, quietly and without allowing the notation to alter his expression. He untied the document. The owl departed without waiting for a reply, which was itself a kind of message. The outer surface bore the official mark of the Goblin Nation, not the commercial mark of Gringotts which appeared on bank correspondence, but the older seal, the one that appeared on documents issued by the governing council rather than its financial arm. He had seen it perhaps 4 times in his life. He broke it carefully and unfolded the parchment on his desk. 2 paragraphs of gobbledygook came first. His gobbledygook was functional but not fluent, and the register was formal and archaic. He understood enough to confirm what he was beginning to suspect. Then he found the English, and he read it. The Goblin Nation of Britain and its affiliated territories hereby declares the Treaty of 1752 null and void, effective at midnight on this date, for cause of sustained violation of its core provisions. The Goblin maintained ward anchors established under Article 4 of the treaty shall be withdrawn upon the treaty's nullification. All associated obligations of the Goblin Nation are hereby discharged. He set the letter down. He placed his hands flat on the surface of the desk, his long fingers spread open, pressing into the wood, and he sat very still. And outside the high windows, the November sky went on being November, pale and colorless and indifferent, carrying a fine drizzle that had been falling since morning. He sat still for a long time. The door opened. McGonagall came in with a folder of attendance records, something routine. She crossed the room 3 paces before she stopped. She had known him for 30 years. In that time, she had seen him exhausted, and she had seen him furious, and she had seen him sit through the deaths of colleagues with a grief so carefully controlled. It emerged only in the set of his shoulders. She thought she knew the full range of expressions available to Albus Dumbledore. She had not seen this one. What, she said, not what's wrong. Just what? He slid the letter across the desk without a word, turned it over, as though looking for something, on the back. Read it again. The ward anchors under London, she said. The ones woven into the city's concealment grid? Yes. She looked up. Her voice, when it came, was the voice she used when she had identified the source of an error and needed the student to understand it had consequences. How long have we known about the sword? I have known since I became headmaster. The silence that followed had the quality of something very large settling somewhere deep below the floor. She did not speak. He watched her, and he watched her decide not to say any of the several things she might have said, and he watched her file them away into the interior space she maintained for things Albus Dumbledore had done that she would not in the end. He was grateful for it. He was also, beneath the gratitude, quietly ashamed. A portrait stirred. Phineas Nigellus Black was already sitting forward, his silver hair vivid against the dark painted background, his expression carrying the sharp interest of a man who enjoyed knowing things before he was supposed to. The Treaty of 1752, he said, as though tasting something long anticipated. The Register of Works was an obligation, not a suggestion. Thank you, Phineas, Dumbledore said. The question now, thank you, Dumbledore said again with a gentleness that was absolute and left no room for continuation. Several other portraits had opinions. He asked them to be quiet. They subsided with varying degrees of muttering that continued under everything else for the rest of the evening. He drew his wand and cast the Patronus. The silver bird emerged, a phoenix, all wings and light, and he spoke to it quietly and sent it down through the floor toward the dungeons. Snape arrived in 11 minutes, which meant he had not been in his office when the Patronus found him. He entered without knocking, closed the door behind him, crossed to the desk, and picked up the letter. His face went a shade more controlled than it usually was, which was already considerable. He set the letter down. "What do you need from me? Not how did this happen? Not how bad is it?" Immediately toward the practical shape of the problem. Dumbledore had always valued this, about Severus Snape, the refusal to waste time on sentiment when there was work to do. "The sword of Gryffindor is in this office," Dumbledore said. "It needs to remain here tonight and be secured. Standard wizarding concealment only, nothing that would register on a probe. I do not want it moved before I have had time to think clearly." Snape nodded. "And no action regarding the Goblin liaison office or the ministry. No communications, no alerts, nothing. Not tonight, not without my specific instruction." Snape nodded again. He paused at the door, his back to the room. "You've known about the sword," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Dumbledore said. Snape, left, McGonagall stood at the window throughout. Neither of them spoke after that. The drizzle thickened into proper November rain, and the office ticked on around them, the small instruments humming and clicking, the portraits breathing in their painted sleep, and there was nothing to do but wait for midnight. It came without ceremony. The wards did not shatter, they did not collapse or crash or announce themselves. A withdrawal of this kind was a subtraction, not an explosion. The Goblin maintained anchors that had been woven into Britain's outer concealment grid for 242 years, simply ceased to hold their part of the weave. McGonagall felt it as a change in pressure. A subterranean shudder below the threshold of hearing, the way you sensed a storm's approach not through the ears but through the body's deeper channels, the sinuses, the small bones behind the jaw, the skin on the backs of the hands. The castle's own enchantments held. Hogwarts stood, as it had always stood, but Dumbledore, watching his instruments, saw the smaller devices, old ones, the ones that had monitored the outer concealment grid since long before he took the position, go dark, one by one, quietly, like candles in a slow and patient wind. He counted 7 of them, then 3 more, then the 11th and the last. In the valley at Little Hangleton, Voldemort felt it, the way you feel a door open in a closed room, a sudden awareness of space where none had been. His instruments confirmed what his body already understood. He sat forward, his chalk-white hands flat on the table, his red eyes moving in the darkness with the focused attention of a predator measuring a newly changed landscape. He turned his head. Pettigrew was near the door, small and attentive in the way of a man who had learned that attentiveness was the only thing keeping him alive. "Call Lucius," Voldemort said quietly. "Immediately." Hermione woke at 5:43 and lay still for a moment, listening. She had spent 5 years living inside Hogwarts, and she knew the castle's rhythms. The particular quality of its silence before dawn, the way the stone breathed differently in November than in September, the low, almost sound the portraits made when they were sleeping versus the different almost sound they made when they were awake and pretending. She had never been able to explain this to Ron, who thought the castle was simply a building, or to Harry, who felt it the way you felt weather without thinking about why. For Hermione, it was a pattern, and this morning the pattern was wrong. She got out of bed. The dormitory was dark, the other girls still asleep, and she crossed to the window in her socks and looked out at the grounds. The hill was visible in the thin grey, pre-dawn light. At its edge, where the ground sloped down toward the outer perimeter of the wards, 3 figures, stood in waterproof jackets, bright blue vivid against the November grey, the kind of garment Muggles wore for walking. They were looking at the castle, not with the vague, confused expression of someone who had nearly registered something. She knew that look, had seen Muggles in London produce it when they walked past an enchanted doorway. These three were looking at Hogwarts, the way you looked at any large and interesting building you had come across on a walk, with uncomplicated tourist curiosity. The outer concealment layer had slipped, the castle was visible. She stood at the window for longer than she meant to. Then she went to her wand. She had set a monitoring charm on it 10 days ago during a charms experiment, a delicate little spell designed to detect when the trace registered her own magic. It had been working correctly all week, logging her spells, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the Ministry's detection thresholds, a tidy column of data she checked each morning for her notes. It had flagged 2 spells she had cast an hour ago as unregistered. It had logged 3 spells she had never cast at all. And the trace registration signal itself was flickering, on, off, on again, like a candle in a draught. She got dressed in 2 minutes. She was at the library before 6. The book she needed was not in the main collection. It was in the restricted annex, not the restricted section which required a teacher's note, but the secondary annex on the upper floor that held the drier categories of wizarding administrative history, the kind of scholarship that no student had touched voluntarily since approximately 1923. She had been in it twice. She found the volume on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. Treaties and Obligations of the Goblin Accord Era, compiled 1801, bound in dark green cloth with gold lettering that had mostly flaked away. She had dismissed it 3 weeks ago as irrelevant to anything she was currently studying. She sat down at the nearest table with it and turned to the table of contents. Chapter 11. The Treaty of 1752. Her cold hands went a little colder. She read for 40 minutes without moving. When she was done, she sat for a moment with the book closed under her hands, thinking about what she had read, and what it meant, and what it implied about the things she had seen outside the window at dawn, and what it implied about the erratic trace monitoring, and what it implied about the larger question of what happened to Britain's concealment infrastructure if the ward anchors described in Chapter 11 were no longer operative. She thought about this for precisely as long as it took to reach a conclusion she was confident in. Then she went to find Harry and Ron. 2 floors below and 400 miles south, Arthur Weasley arrived at the Ministry of Magic at 7:52 and found a memo waiting on his desk. Not one of the green ministry memos that circulated through normal administrative channels, one of the orange-bordered urgent ones, which he had only seen twice before in 20 years, and which meant a compulsory all-hands meeting. The meeting was on Level 3, in the largest conference room the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes kept for exactly this kind of occasion. The room was crowded. Arthur counted 32 colleagues, which was more than twice the usual attendance for any committee he belonged to. People were standing at the back. The tea urn at the side table was empty. The reports were not large, not dramatic, not unmistakable, but slightly too many, in slightly the wrong places. 3 sightings of the leaky cauldron's entrance from angles suggesting Muggles had seen the door clearly. A Muggle photographer in Diagon Alley who had managed photographs before the Obliviators reached him. The photographs confiscated, but the man had spoken to a friend first. The thread would take 2 more Obliviators to contain. 2 unregistered magic alerts in Devon that corresponded to no known underage wizard in the area. Arthur recognized the pattern. He knew what it looked like when one coherent system failed quietly, rather than one isolated incident occurring noisily. He also knew that the senior obliviator presenting the reports, who had the look of a man reciting facts he'd been instructed to present without interpretation, knew the same thing, and was not saying so, and that at least 2 others in the room knew it too. Because saying so aloud meant naming a cause, and naming a cause meant admitting the ward system had been breached, and no one in this room had been authorized to say that yet. He stepped out of the meeting at 8:15 on the pretext of retrieving additional reports from his office. He sat in the empty corridor outside instead and looked at the wall across from him. He thought about the Goblin liaison office on level 2, directly above him. He thought about 20 years of corridor conversations, half-heard treaty documents rolled under the arms of Goblin officials attending mandatory liaison meetings with the patience of people waiting for something they already knew was coming. An argument he'd overheard once between a senior liaison coordinator and a Goblin representative. The register has not been addressed. These are long-standing matters. And then silence from the Goblin side, which had been, Arthur now understood, a kind of answer. He took a sheet of ministry notepaper, folded it into an aeroplane with practiced ease, addressed it to the Goblin liaison office on level 2, and let it go. It caught the corridor's air current and sailed upward through the enchanted routing system. The response came back in less than 2 minutes, which was faster than any interdepartmental communication he had ever received from any office in 20 years. Not available for comment at this time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his inside pocket. They had been waiting for this. He didn't know yet what this was, precisely only that it was large, and that it had been a long time coming, and that the people who were going to be least surprised were the ones 2 floors above him who had been bringing their treaty documents to meetings for years. He went back into the conference room and sat down and listened to the rest of the reports and said nothing. Hermione found Harry and Ron at breakfast. She sat down across from them, did not take anything from the serving dishes, folded her hands on the table and said quietly, "Something has happened, I think, involving Gringotts, and I think I know what it means. But I need you to hear me out, because it's going to sound like a history of magic essay." "I've had breakfast," Ron said, "so I can probably handle it." She told them about the Treaty of 1752, its ward anchor provisions, the concealment infrastructure it maintained, the registration clause and what it required of Goblin-made objects in wizarding custody. She told them about the 3 muggles on the hill at dawn. She told them about the trace monitoring charm and what it had done with the detection signal overnight. Harry listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he understood something was seriously wrong. When she finished, he said, "What's at the center of it? What did the goblins find? What specifically triggered the voiding?" Hermione pressed her lips together. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know someone who might." Percy Weasley had learned, over the past 4 months as junior assistant to the minister, to read the Ministry of Magic by feel-the-way experienced sailors read weather. This morning, walking in through the atrium at 8 o'clock, he felt it immediately. The particular pressure of a managed crisis. Memos flying at twice the usual frequency. The doors of 3 senior offices closed when they were never closed before noon. People speaking in groups of 2 and 3, and stopping when a 4th person approached, not stopping because the conversation was over, but stopping in the way of people who had agreed, without discussing it, that the conversation should not be overheard. He had felt this once before. In August, when the first reports of you-know-whose return had come in from the Triwizard Tournament, and the minister had made the decision to suppress them. Percy had been new then, still learning what the position required of him, and he had told himself. He was not recognizing what he recognized. He was better at the telling now. The decision to not recognize things had become more practiced, more efficient, something he could perform without having to actively choose it each time. He went to his desk and picked up his stack of reports for the morning and carried them to the ante-room outside the minister's office and sat down to wait. He could hear raised voices through the door. Fudge's voice, the rising pitch of a man who had been cornered and was deciding how to respond to being cornered, and another voice, measured and precise, and speaking English in the particular way that Percy had observed senior Goblin officials used when they wanted to ensure there was no possibility of misunderstanding. He could not hear everything. He caught 3 phrases clearly enough to write them down on his notepad without thinking. Voided, ward anchors, not negotiable. Then Fudge. This is entirely without precedent. Then the Goblin without pause. On the contrary, Minister, it is the precedent set in 1752. The door opened. The Goblin representative walked out, short, composed, grey-coated, moving with the bearing of a person who had said what needed saying and had no interest in saying it again. The outer door closed. The minister's door opened. Fudge's face appeared, florid, the bowler hat slightly askew. The expression of a man who had been embarrassed and was already converting the embarrassment into indignation. Percy wrote the statement. He sat at the small desk to the right of the minister's and took dictation and offered corrections of phrasing when asked, and tried to make the language tighter and more precise than Fudge wanted it to be, and lost most of those small arguments. The Goblin nation had been misled by agitators. The ministry rejected the characterization that any treaty violation had occurred. The phrase, isolated magical fluctuations, appeared in the second paragraph as the official description of the ward failures. Percy wrote isolated magical fluctuations without expression. He had seen the reports from Diagon Alley. He knew what isolated meant and what fluctuations meant, and he knew that neither word meant what this sentence required them to mean. The statement did not name the Sword of Gryffindor. It did not name the ward anchor provisions or what their withdrawal had done to the outer concealment grid. Percy had not been told about the Sword of Gryffindor. He had inferred it very recently from a research summary that had landed on his desk by accident as internal memo routing. He had not mentioned this inference to the minister, who had not asked. He did not look at his reflection in the glass of the framed ministry commendation on the opposite wall. At Hogwarts, the assembly was mandatory and brief. Umbridge stood at the front of the great hall in a shade of pink that managed somehow to feel like an assertion. Not warm, not feminine, simply occupying the space, the way pink occupied the space. Her voice was sweet in the way that certain things were sweet, concentrated enough to be unpleasant. There was an administrative irregularity, she explained, with certain elements of the Goblin nation. Students did not need to concern themselves. The ministry was addressing the matter with appropriate authority. Any discussion of Goblin affairs that caused rumor or unrest or what she called disruption of the educational environment would be treated accordingly. Harry, standing in the third row of Gryffindors, watched her face throughout. She was not worried. There was no anxiety in her expression, no flicker of genuine concern about anything the students might do or know or feel. She was satisfied. It was a very particular kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who had identified an opportunity inside a crisis that other people were experiencing as simply a crisis. He filed this away the way he had learned to file things about Umbridge carefully, without acting on it yet. In the Slytherin common room, 2 floors beneath the lake, Draco Malfoy read his father's letter a second time, and then a third. The handwriting was his father's formal script. the one Lucius used for documents, not for correspondence, which was already a signal. The letter itself was 7 lines in the surface, reading, "Health enquiries, school performance, a mild comment about concentrating on coursework." In the Malfoy family's private code, which Draco had been taught at 8 years old as matter-of-factly as he had been taught table manners, it said something considerably more direct. Stay out of the way. Watch. Do not involve yourself in anything connected to the Goblin news for the next 2 weeks. Your presence is not required. His father's handwriting had a quality Draco had spent 15 years learning to read. The quality now was that of a man who had seen the next several moves on a board and was not troubled by them. Not alarmed, not defensive. The particular stillness of someone in position. Draco folded the letter along its original creases and put it in the inner pocket of his robe. He did not know what his father was being deployed for. He knew that the word deployed was the right word. Not asked, not invited, but positioned, the way you positioned pieces when the board was moving towards something significant. He looked out at the dark lake beyond the common room's low windows. The water was very still, lit from somewhere far above by the diffused grey of a November sky filtered through 50 feet of depth, and it looked, this morning, exactly like the surface of something that was waiting. Back at the ministry, long after the other staff had gone, Percy sat at his desk. The research summary from the Goblin Liaison Office was still in his out tray where he had placed it 4 hours ago, marked background reading, not for distribution, which was the kind of classification that meant it had been sent to his desk by administrative accident rather than intention. He had filed it once. He took it out of the out tray. He read as far as the clause about the Register of Works, the registration obligation, the 12-month compliance window that had expired in 1753 and been left expired for 242 years. And then he closed it and set it on the desk. He sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular. Then he opened it again and read. The newspaper was 3 days old. Sirius had read it 4 times already, not because he found it interesting, but because reading a newspaper, even a 3-day-old one, was preferable to continuing to do nothing in a room that reminded him, constantly and without mercy. 12 Grimmauld Place had been his family's house before it was his, and before it was his in any meaningful sense it had spent 12 years being no one's, and the house had absorbed all of that history with the patient thoroughness of very old stone. The kitchen was large and dark and smelled of the cleaning charms Molly had put on it in August, and it was a perfectly adequate kitchen, and Sirius had been sitting in it for 6 months doing variations of nothing while the world conducted itself without him. The newspaper had a small item on the 3rd page about unexplained magical anomalies in several Muggle-adjacent areas of London. The item used the phrase, harmless atmospheric disturbances. Sirius had the cipher-decoded note from Dumbledore in his pocket. He had read both items and compared them, and found the comparison to be very instructive about the Ministry's relationship to the concept of information. He heard the front door. The Order had their own method of entry that bypassed Mrs. Black's portrait and went upstairs. They arrived over the course of 2 hours. Tonks first. Her hair pulled into something dark and close to her head, the shade she went when she was trying not to visibly react to something. Then Arthur, direct from the Ministry, with the creased look of a man who had spent his morning in meetings he wasn't supposed to take seriously, but had. Then Molly, who took one look at the kitchen and started heating water for tea, with the efficient energy of someone channeling her anxiety into something practical. Lupin arrived 40 minutes later, travel-worn, the lines in his face deeper than usual, his robes carrying the specific kind of cold that came from being outdoors for a long time. He had come back from somewhere in a hurry. Bill came last. Sirius had known Bill Weasley since before Azkaban. There was a version of Bill that existed in his memory as a small, serious child following Arthur around at Order meetings a long time ago. This version was 24 years old and had his father's height and neither parent's patience with sitting still in a crisis. And he had been effectively locked out of Gringotts since the morning after the voiding. He came in with his red hair still pulled back and mud on his dragonhide boots, and a look that said he had things to say, but was waiting to see what the room already knew. Dumbledore arrived last. He stood at the head of the table with the particular quality of stillness that Sirius had come to associate specifically with him, not the stillness of a man who was calm, but the stillness of a man who was managing a great deal of weight, and had decided a long time ago. He laid out the shape of the situation in the economical way he had when he considered every word a cost. The ward anchors beneath London had been maintained by the Goblin nation since 1752 under a treaty provision Article 4 that required in exchange a registration commitment that the wizarding institutions of Britain had never fulfilled. The Goblin nation had exercised their legal right to void. The outer concealment grid was degrading. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes was managing the failures through emergency obliviators. There were already more sightings of the leaky cauldron and the edges of Diagon Alley than the service could comfortably address. The obliviators were a stopgap. If the ward anchors were not restored, Britain's magical concealment would fail completely. Probably within a month. No one said anything for a moment. "Give them the sword," Sirius said. "Whatever they want, give it to them." "It's not that simple," Arthur said. He was doing the particular gentle voice he used when he disagreed with Sirius and wanted to continue doing so without the conversation becoming a different kind of conversation. "It seems that simple to me. They want a piece of goblin-made metalwork back. We give it to them, and we negotiate the ward restoration, and this gets solved before anyone sees Hogwarts from the Muggle motorway." "There's more to it." Arthur looked at the table. "There are 2 violations. We only know the shape of one." Sirius looked at Bill, who was sitting at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Bill said nothing yet. "The Ministry," Molly said, with a particular compression of those 3 words that indicated she was exercising considerable restraint. "Is currently doing what, exactly?" Arthur said. "Drafting a denial." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had a color. Tonks leaned forward. She had her Auror's report in her hand, a single folded page, the kind the department kept for verbal delivery, and she set it flat on the table without unfolding it. "The Goblin representatives at our London contacts have gone dark. All of them, no scheduled meetings, no informal correspondence, no accidental encounters in public spaces that might as well be deliberate ones." She paused. "The silence is structured. It's not that they've stopped communicating, it's that they've stopped communicating with us. Someone is talking to them. It isn't anyone in this room. The room processed this." Lupin was watching the middle distance in the way he did when he was running through implications. Arthur's expression had gone carefully neutral. Sirius found he could not sit still any longer and stood, moving to the fireplace. Because at least that was a different version of uselessness. Harry had been sitting at the corner of the table for the last 20 minutes. He had arrived partway through Dumbledore's summary, escorted from Hogwarts under the Order's emergency travel provisions, and he had sat down and listened without asking any of the several questions he had clearly been holding. Sirius knew Harry's listening face. He could see him arranging something. What did we actually do to them? The room looked at him, not us specifically, not the Order. But what did wizards actually do to the goblins in 1752? And what have we been doing since? Before we work out what we're going to do about it, I want to know what the actual wrong was. Lupin said after a moment, "We kept a sword that belongs to them for 242 years without registering it or returning it," Harry said. "Is that all?" No one answered that with the fullness it deserved. Sirius noticed this. He suspected Harry noticed it too. "I'd like to know what all of it is," Harry said, "before we start deciding how to fix it." He wasn't being difficult about it. Sirius knew the difference between Harry being difficult and Harry being precise. Otherwise, we're going to get halfway through fixing it and find out there was more, and then we'll be negotiating from a worse position than we started, Dumbledore said. "That is well observed." He said it without condescension. Which was the specific quality that made it land, instead of glancing off? He looked at Harry with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was near that neighborhood. "There is more. I intend to tell you." The meeting broke apart gradually, the way Order meetings did, not decisively, but in stages, people drifting into corridor conversations or toward the door, the practical aftermath of a conversation that had shifted the ground. Lupin and Tonks left together. Arthur went to find Molly, who had disappeared into some further productive act of worry. Bill stayed. He had not moved from the end of the table. Dumbledore looked at him, then at Harry, and gestured, a small, unhurried movement, for Harry to stay too. Bill said. There was a second resonance. He kept his voice level. He had clearly decided how to do this and had been holding the version ready. Not the northern signal, something from inside the building, a vault in the deep high security level, a cup, not goblin-made, no property question, but the probe read death magic inside it. The head officer called it desecrated. He paused. Whoever owns that vault brought murder magic into a goblin institution without declaring it. The elders told me the voiding stands on the sword alone. That was sufficient. But the vault discovery made it feel necessary, not just legal. Dumbledore's face did not change. He said, "Yes, I had hoped that peace would not come into it." A pause, brief, precise. "It has." He did not explain further. Harry sat very still at the corner of the table and looked at Dumbledore and filed the absence of explanation away in the same careful place he filed everything he wasn't yet supposed to understand. The marble hall of Gringotts smelled the same as it always did. Cold stone, old metal, the faint mineral tang of something very deep. The goblins at their high counters moved through the morning's banking traffic without any visible change in their manner. Coins were weighed. Documents were stamped. The long queue of humans at the main counter shuffled forward with the patient resignation of people who had accepted that this process would take as long as it took. Bill sat in a chair against the far wall and waited. He had his employment status technically intact. His Cursebreaker contract had not been formally suspended. There had been no letter, no official communication, no instruction of any kind. He was on a kind of undefined pause, which was its own message. He had arrived that morning and asked, through the standard intake counter, to speak with his usual goblin contact. The counter goblin had said, without expression, that the contact was in a restricted session. He had asked for anyone from the audit team, also in a restricted session. He had asked more generally if there was anyone available from the Deep Vault Management Division who might be able to speak with him. There had been a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was a long pause for a goblin, and then, not at this time, he bought a newspaper from the stand near the door and sat down and read it for 2 hours. He was on his second careful reading of an article about Chudley cannons, when a presence appeared at his left elbow, small, precise, a goblin he recognized immediately by the particular economy of his movements. "Walk with me," Grifhook said very quietly, not looking at him. Bill folded the newspaper and followed. The service corridor ran below the main floor, accessed through a plain stone door behind the rows of filing cabinets that the public never looked at closely enough to notice. Grifhook led him down one flight of stairs and along a passage lit by brackets of small blue-white flame, and then stopped in an alcove where the sound from above was a distant murmur. "This is not an official communication," Grifhook said. He said it the way you said something that was both completely true and a necessary formality. "I have worked with you for 3 years. You are not dishonest in the way that most wizards who work here are dishonest." Bill took this for the compliment it was. What did the probes actually find? Grifhook told him. The northern signal first, goblin make, deep, very old, held under a continuous concealment charm of wizard origin. The signature was the sword of Gryffindors without question. Goblin craftwork had a kind of specificity that aged but did not dilute the way a voice remained recognizable over decades. The location had not been a discovery. The goblins had known where the sword was for years. What the audit had produced was something different, a formal documentation of ongoing breach. The kind that could be entered into the council's record. The kind that gave a councillor who wanted to call a vote something solid enough to stand on. "How long has the council been waiting for that?" Bill asked. Grifhook's expression moved very slightly in a direction that was not quite amusement and not quite bitterness. "There have been councillors who wanted to call this vote since before you were born," he said. Then Grifhook described the second signal. He described it with a visible reluctance that Bill recognized. Not professional reluctance, not the careful management of official information, but the reluctance of a person who had encountered something genuinely disturbing. Grifhook had worked with dark magic-cursed objects for decades. Bill knew this because their earliest work together had been the cataloguing of a mummy's curse in a sub-vault that predated the current building, and Grifhook had handled that with complete professional composure. The cup had disturbed him. "It is registered as a personal heirloom," Grifhook said. "Not goblin-made, no property question arises." He paused. "But inside it, at a level the standard instruments cannot reach, but the deep scan probes can. There is a fragment. A shard of intention that is not the cup's own, something that was made, deliberately, and placed there by force." Another pause. "It reeks of death, not death magic in the general sense, not a curse, not a hex. This is older, deeper. Whoever made this used a human life to make it." Bill said nothing for a moment. "We were not told," Grifhook said. "The person who placed that cup in our vault did not tell us what it was. Gringotts is not a charnel house. We do not store murder for people. Not knowingly." He looked at Bill directly, the sharp black eyes, the complete steadiness, the voiding stands on the sword. The clause is clear, and the breach is documented, and the sword alone was sufficient. But the council felt the cup, and the council felt that whoever was responsible for keeping the sword had also sent their associates. To use our house as a place to put murder, that is not a property grievance. It is a different thing entirely. Bill walked out of Gringotts into the pale November light of Diagon Alley and stood on the pavement for a moment, letting the cold air work. He knew what the cup was. He hadn't known it for certain, he had suspected since the night of the scan, since Dumbledore had said, "I had hoped that peace would not come into it," with exactly the expression of someone confirming a thing they had not wanted confirmed. Now he knew. The probes had read a Horcrux. The goblins did not have a name for it, and did not need one. They had categorized it correctly on first contact, something made from murder, deposited in their institution without disclosure, and they were furious about it on entirely reasonable grounds. The staggering part was the opening this created. Voldemort's people would tell him there were always people in a building this size whose loyalties were negotiable, and Voldemort would understand immediately that the goblins had an object he could appear helpful about. Remove the cup, clean the desecration, express outrage that murder magic had been stored in goblin territory without consent. A gesture of respect for goblin independence. In exchange, goodwill, access. The beginnings of an alliance the wizarding world's concealment infrastructure could not survive. Bill sent his Patronus a jackal, lean and pale, carrying the message in his own words, toward Hogwarts and Dumbledore, and watched it go, and then walked back up Diagon Alley at a pace that was not quite running. In the Hogwarts library, 3 hours later, Hermione had her notes spread across the widest table she could find, and was looking at them with the focused intensity of a person who had just seen two separate things click into alignment. The second source was a Ministry Archive diplomatic summary from 1754, 2 years after the treaty, compiled by a Wizengamot liaison officer tasked with understanding what the ward anchor provisions actually committed Britain to. It was dry and extraordinarily specific about geography. The anchor points were beneath central London, directly under Diagon Alley, under what was now the Ministry of Magic, distributed across a grid that matched with cold clarity the exact pattern of concealment failures over the past 4 days. The failures were not random, they were radiating outward from the anchor locations, the way a web lost tension when its central threads were cut. Without the anchors, concealment failed from the inside out. The most magically dense locations in Britain would become visible first, then everything else. She had annotated it in 3 colors and brought it to Harry and Ron. Harry looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, if Voldemort knew any of this, what would he do with it? She had been expecting the question. She had been thinking about it for the last hour in the back of her mind behind the annotation work. He'd use it, she said. He'd find a way to give the goblins what they want, or enough of what they want to make them willing to listen. And he'd do it before we could. The window nearest Harry flickered with a brief cold light. Silver. Directional, the unmistakable shape of a forwarded order message. It resolved into a few short sentences before it dissolved, and Harry read them twice, and his face went through something that was not surprise, but was the expression of a person watching an expected thing happen. He looked at Hermione. Bill confirmed the cup, he said. Voldemort's people will know by tonight. Hermione looked at her annotated map and felt the shape of what was coming settle into place. They needed to move. She was already thinking about how. The ward failure was larger than his informants had suggested. Voldemort sat in the study of the Riddle House and read the reports. 3 separate accounts, cross-referenced, 2 from ministry employees and 1 from a source closer to the Goblin Nation itself, and found that the outer concealment grid was degrading faster than any model of the treaty's mechanics would have predicted. He found this interesting. The goblins had been precise about their withdrawal. They had pulled the ward anchors on schedule at midnight, and the decay was now following a geometry that was mathematical rather than random. They had designed this, not just the voiding. The rate of visible failure was intentional. They wanted the breach to be legible. He set the reports down. He had known, for nearly 2 years, that the Treaty of 1752 was a problem waiting to be used. The sword in Dumbledore's office was a documented breach. The Register of Works had not been updated in 242 years. The goblins had a legal right to void that no competent barrister could challenge. He had been surprised only by the timing, which was faster than he had allowed for, and therefore someone or something had provided the catalyst. He filed this observation away. It did not change the strategy, it sharpened it. The question was what the goblins actually wanted. He had studied human greed for 60 years. Goblin greed was different. It was not accumulation. Gold was a medium, not a goal. What the goblins wanted, across every rebellion and broken promise, was acknowledgement. Wands in their hands, their own property in their own custody. They wanted to be recognized as equals. These were things Voldemort could offer, until they were no longer convenient to offer. The gap between those two moments was sufficient for his purposes. He called Pettigrew. Wormtail shuffled in from the adjoining room, small, pallid, the silver hand at his side catching the firelight in a way that made it look detached from him, which Voldemort occasionally found useful to remember. He was, in most practical senses, a deeply unsatisfactory servant. But every order member, every auror, every ministry official with access to the wanted circulars knew Peter Pettigrew's face. "You will go to Gringotts," Voldemort said. "You will ask at the public counter to leave a message for the Goblin Nation's Council liaison. The message will state that the Dark Lord's representative seeks an audience at the Council's convenience. You will give your name," he paused. "Your real name." Pettigrew's face did something complicated. "They'll know who I am." Yes, that is the point. The point was this: sending Pettigrew signaled history. It told the goblins this was not an impulsive approach. This was a continuation of a relationship developing since the early overtures, the tentative contacts made before his restoration. We have been considering this together for some time. It also told him something useful. If they received Pettigrew, if they let him deliver the message, they were willing to listen, they received him, they let him leave. Lucius arrived at Gringotts the following morning. He entered without his cane. He had considered this decision for most of the previous evening and concluded that it was the correct one, walking into the bank without his wand. Even a wand concealed inside an elegant silver-tipped stick was a legible acknowledgement that he was in goblin territory and was conducting himself accordingly. The goblins noticed things like this. The goblins, unlike most of the people Lucius dealt with professionally, paid attention. He was made to wait in the public hall for 40 minutes. He sat in the plain wooden chair they indicated, which was positioned in a deliberate sight line with the main counter, and he did not cross his legs or adjust his robes or look at his watch. He looked at the marble columns and the high ceiling and the chandeliers and composed his face into the particular expression, attentive, unhurried, serene, that he had developed over years of waiting in rooms where powerful people wanted to see if he would show irritation. He did not show irritation. 3 goblin representatives met him in a meeting room off the main hall. The room was plain stone, a single table, 3 chairs on each side, the kind of room that communicated by its simplicity that this institution had no interest in impressing anyone. Lucius presented the offer in 3 parts, as he had been instructed, without preamble or diplomatic softening. First, under the governance of the new order, goblins would be permitted to carry and use wands without restriction. The laws prohibiting it would be struck from the books at the moment of transition. Second, the ownership law governing goblin-made objects would be reformed. All goblin-made items currently held in wizarding custody would be inventoried and returned to Goblin ownership within 5 years of any new governance settlement. The Register of Works would be made binding on both parties. Third, Bringet's and its associated governing structure would be elevated to co-equal standing with the Ministry of Magic as a governing institution of Wizarding Britain. Decisions affecting the magical population would require the agreement of both bodies. He set his hands flat on the table and was quiet. The 3 Goblin representatives looked at him. Then they looked at each other, in the specific way that he had observed goblins look at each other during the few high-level encounters he had been party to, not exchanging glances, but conducting a brief, wordless calculation. Then they looked at him again. The eldest spoke. Her voice was precise and unhurried, and she spoke English the way she apparently chose to, clearly and with full intention. "We have heard offers before," she said. She did not say from whom, or when, or how those offers had ended. She did not need to. The history was the context. "We will deliberate," she said. Lucius folded his hands and inclined his head, and thanked them for their time, and left. He had been told to accept anything except an immediate refusal as a success. He walked out onto Diagon Alley in the November cold, and recognized with the specific satisfaction of a professional completing a task precisely to specification that this had been a success. That evening he stood in the study at the Riddle House and reported. Pettigrew had positioned himself in the corner of the room, with the hunched, self-effacing posture of a man who sincerely hoped the furniture would eventually absorb him. Voldemort listened to the report without moving. "They are considering," he said. He said it not as a summary, but as a confirmation of an expectation already met. He was quiet for a moment. "Did they mention a second item?" "Something in a vault," Lucius said. "No." Voldemort was quiet again. "Then they will. When they do, you will tell them that this can be remedied, that you can remove whatever is in that vault and restore the object to its proper state. May I ask?" "No." Lucius accepted this without visible reaction, which was why Lucius was useful in his corner. Pettigrew understood. He knew what was in the cup, what had been put there by methods he did not allow himself to think about carefully. He knew what removing it would require. He knew the Dark Lord was offering to give it up, which was alarming in ways he could not quite order into a sensible sequence. He said nothing. He had learned, over a long career of being in the wrong room at the wrong time, that this was the only reliable form of survival available to him. Draco Malfoy did not know his father had gone to Gringotts twice. He knew his father had been away. The manor had a particular quality in his father's absence, quieter and somehow more careful, as though the house itself adjusted its behavior when Lucius was not present to observe it. When his father returned the second time, Draco was in the drawing room pretending to read. He watched Lucius set his gloves on the table near the door and accept a glass of wine from the house elf and stand at the window for a moment, looking out at the darkened grounds. His father was pleased. Not triumphant Lucius very rarely allowed himself triumphant, which Draco had understood from childhood was its own kind of discipline. But there was a quality of quiet satisfaction in his posture that Draco had learned, over 15 years of observation, to read accurately. Whatever this was, it was going well. Draco looked back at his book. He thought, this is going to reach Hogwarts eventually. He did not know how. He did not know when. He thought he would probably recognize it when it arrived. The letter arrived at 7 in the morning, delivered not by Owl, but by a goblin courier, a young one, formally dressed, who knocked at the door of Bill's Diagon Alley lodgings with the kind of composed efficiency that suggested this errand was entirely routine. The envelope was heavy cream paper. The seal was wax, stamped with an impression he didn't recognize. Not the standard Gringotts mark, not anything from the bank's administrative correspondence. Something older, the kind of symbol you found on documents that predated the current building. He broke it open. The note was 11 lines. He was invited to meet with a delegation of the Goblin Council. The address was Gringotts. The time was 9 o'clock. He had 1 hour to respond. He wrote his response. A single line, yes, and gave it to the courier and closed the door and stood in his kitchen for a moment, thinking about what to put on. He went with what he had. Dragonhide boots, the long red hair pulled back, the fang earring. Nothing formal, because he didn't have anything formal that felt honest. The ministry robes he owned for occasions felt like a costume, and a costume was exactly the wrong thing to bring into a room with 9 people who had been professionally assessing human dishonesty since before his parents. They took him past the vaults. He had been to the audit levels, the conference rooms, the old hand-dressed corridor where the 7 elders had shown him the treaty. This was past all of that, past the sub-levels where the cart tracks ran. Down a tunnel the tracks didn't reach. Cut through stone that was older than the streets above, in a way you felt in your chest rather than saw. The goblin escort did not speak. The lanterns were the same low amber as the deep chamber, and the air tasted of very old earth and something mineral, something that had no name in English. The room at the end was carved from the bedrock. 9 goblin councillors sat in a curved arrangement at a low table of dark stone. There were no chairs for visitors. Bill stood, which seemed appropriate. The room smelled of old metal and deep cold. On the table, a scroll he recognized as a genuine probity probe audit record, the kind he had signed as witness 6 times. A document in gobbledygook that he could read fragments of, the Register of Works, old enough to have gone yellowish at the edges. And a third document, transcribed in a careful hand onto clean parchment that after a moment he understood was a copy of Voldemort's offer. The head councillor, the eldest, the one who had the gravity of someone who had been making decisions for a very long time and had learned to make them without rushing, spoke in English, which meant this was official. You have seen the scan results? Not a question. He had been at the audit, the register. He had seen it in the old chamber during the treaty meeting, and the desecrated object report from the high-security vault. He had heard it from Griffith. The Goblin Nation has received a formal offer from the Dark Lord's representative, which you may have been made aware of. A pause. You are the only wizard who has attempted honest communication with this institution. Since the voiding, we are extending a professional courtesy before we reach our decision. You may speak. Bill looked at the 9 faces. They were watching him with the complete attention of people who had assessed a great many wizards over a great many years and knew exactly what variety of deflection and performance and managed sincerity each variety tended to produce. He had no counteroffer. Dumbledore had not authorized any formal commitment. He had himself. 24 years old, 6 years in this building, no ministry backing and nothing that could match a 3-point offer, addressing every historical injustice the Goblin Nation had spent 2 centuries naming. He had one thing. I know we wronged you, he said. Not as a position, not as a tactic to get you to do what I want, as a fact. The sword of Gryffindor should have been returned in 1753, and it wasn't. And the register should have been honored, and it wasn't. And nobody on our side has ever stood in front of your council and just said that plainly. I'm not here to tell you something you don't know. You've known all of it for 242 years. I'm here to say it plainly because I think it should be said, and I don't know who else is going to do it. He paused. The room was completely silent. If you go to him, if you take the offer that's on the table, you won't get what he's promising. You know what he does with promises. You've read the history better than we have. Every promise that has ever been made to the Goblin nation by a wizard who needed something has had a point at which it stopped being convenient. He's not different. He's worse, actually, because he's the kind of person who considers everyone who isn't him to be useful until they aren't. He stopped himself from saying more. He had run through this in his head at 3 a.m, and the version he was saying now was shorter and less eloquent than that version. But it was truer. I can't match what's on that paper. I can't promise you wands and governance parity right now, because I'm 24 years old, and I work in your building, and I don't have the authority. But I can tell you that the person who does have the authority will come and say this to you properly. And he will come because what's on this table is documented wrongdoing that has a documented remedy, and he has the kind of mind that does not let documented wrongs sit unremedied. He sat down. The councillors conferred in gobbledygook. He sat and listened to the language move around the room, the close, compressed consonants, the vowels that shifted their meaning by tiny degrees of placement, the particular rhythm of formal deliberation. His gobbledygook was functional. Here, in the oldest room he had ever been in, with 9 people who spoke it as the language of law and history and professional life, it was less than functional. He understood fragments. He heard the word for honest. He heard it 3 times, used by different voices, which he hoped was meaningful in the way he thought it was. He heard once the word for insufficient, spoken in a register that suggested it was a counterpoint rather than a conclusion. He could not hear the balance. After 11 minutes, the head councillor looked at him. "The council will make no decision today," he said. "We are expecting a formal approach from the wizarding side at the highest level. Within 24 hours, this approach must acknowledge the wrongs documented here without equivocation. If no such approach is received, we will proceed with the offer currently on the table." Bill said, "That will come. I will make sure of it." He said it with confidence he was not entirely certain he was entitled to. He walked out into the grey daylight of Diagon Alley, stood on the pavement, breathed cold air, and thought about what he had just committed to on behalf of a man who had not asked him to. Then he sent his Patronus, pale and quick, and carrying the message in full, and started walking, because standing still was something he could not currently manage. That evening, Harry was in the Gryffindor common room with Hermione's annotated map spread across the low table when the light came through the window. Silver directed the brief, concentrated flash of a forwarded order message. He read what it carried twice, 24 hours. One approach at the highest level. Acknowledge the wrong without equivocating, or the goblins take Voldemort's offer. He looked at Hermione. She was already thinking. He could see it. The specific quality of her stillness when she was moving through implications faster than she was saying them. Ron was watching him. "Dumbledore," Harry said. "It has to be Dumbledore." "Yes," Hermione said. "And if he goes to them—" Harry stopped. He was thinking about the desecrated vault. The cup. The thing Griffith had described to Bill, and Bill had described to the Order. Death magic. A fragment of something that had been made from murder. He thought about what Dumbledore had said in Grimmauld Place. I had hoped that peace would not come into it. The specific quality of that statement. The specific weight of the word hoped. If he goes to them, he has to tell them what the cup actually is, what it means, why it's there, Hermione said, which means telling them about the Horcruxes, which means the goblins will know something the Ministry doesn't. A brief, quiet. He's going to tell them everything isn't he?" Harry said. "If he's wise," Hermione said. The certainty in her voice was the kind that came from having thought through the alternatives. Ron had been quiet through most of this. He said, "Well, good thing he's the wisest person we know." Nobody argued with that. The reports had started arriving before breakfast. Harry had been awake since 5. The scar had been quiet, nothing specific, but the quality of the castle's silence was different from the silence of the night before, charged in a way that made sleep feel like a bad idea. He sat in the window seat of the dormitory and watched the grounds go from black to grey to the flat, effectless light of a November morning, and at 6:43 a series of owls came in rapid succession to the owlery and did not stop for the next hour. Hermione had the reports by 8. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes was at maximum deployment, every obliviator the service had, working in rotating shifts, covering a geography that was expanding faster than the shifts could address. A Muggle photograph on a new kind of network, something that lived in computers, had reached several thousand people before the Magical Monitoring Office identified it. The photograph showed a door on a London street opening onto a cobbled alley, with a leaky-looking wooden sign above it. There was a Muggle news item about a hidden alley behind a pub. 3 walkers near the Forbidden Forest's outer perimeter had photographed a family of nifflers rootling through the undergrowth, a creature that looked like nothing in any Muggle wildlife guide. The obliviators had reached the walkers. They had not yet reached the photograph. Hogwarts held. Its own ancient protections were intact. Harry could feel this the same way Hermione had described feeling the castle's rhythm, though he had never had a name for it until she named it for him. But outside the grounds, the boundary between the wizarding world and the Muggle one was dissolving at a rate that 114 obliviators working continuously could not reverse. The owl for Embridge arrived mid-morning. Harry saw her leave from the corridor window, short, pink, moving across the courtyard, with the particular urgency of someone who had been recalled rather than summoned, which was a slightly different quality of movement. She was gone before lunch. The castle's atmosphere changed within an hour, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a room changed when someone who had been taking up space without contributing anything left it. The D.A. gathered in the room of requirement that afternoon, not for drills. The room seemed to understand this and had arranged itself as a sitting room rather than a practice hall, cushioned and warm and without targets. They sat in a loose circle and thought. Harry went to the headmaster's office at 2 o'clock. He did not knock. Dumbledore was at his desk with the small instruments, the ones he had watched go dark on the night of the ward failure, now arranged in a different configuration, as though he had been considering their new purposes. He did not appear surprised, which was either a function of being 114 years old and therefore unsurprisable by most things, or a function of having been expecting Harry in particular. "There's a Horcrux in Bellatrix's vault," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. His expression did not change. "The goblins know it's desecrated," Harry said. "They don't know what it is. They have a word for something that's been filled with death magic against its nature. They called it desecrated, and they're furious about it on their own terms, but they don't know what Voldemort did to make it." He had been working this out since the conversation in the common room, since Ron's dry observation about Dumbledore being the wisest person they knew. If you go to them and tell them what it actually is, not just that we kept a sword that was theirs, but that Voldemort put a piece of himself in one of their treasures, used their institution to house something made from murder without their knowledge or consent, that's different from his offer. That's the truth, and you can't counter Voldemort's offer with a better lie. You can only counter it with something he can't offer." "Which is?" Dumbledore asked. His voice was very quiet. "The truth about what he is." The room was still for a moment. Fawkes, the phoenix on his perch in the corner, made a low, soft sound. Outside the tall windows, the November sky continued its indifferent grey. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Then you have to go." "I had already decided to go, Harry. I was considering whether to tell you I was going." A pause. "I have just decided. Yes." Harry sat down in the chair in front of the desk uninvited. "What do you need from me?" Dumbledore said, "I need you to come with me." He rose from the desk and led Harry to the far wall, where the sword of Gryffindor hung in its usual place on its usual mount. Harry had walked past it dozens of times. It had been a piece of the room's furniture, the same way the portraits were furniture, part of the expected visual landscape of the headmaster's office. Now he stood in front of it and looked at it properly. The silver blade caught the firelight and held it. The rubies in the hilt were very dark, very red. It was clearly, unmistakably, the work of someone who had made things to last, the proportions exact, the detailing without flaw, the kind of craftsmanship that announced itself without needing to. "It's going to have to go back," Harry said. "It has always had to go back," Dumbledore said. "We simply failed to honor that obligation for rather a long time." Harry looked at the blade a moment longer. "Is it still going to come when a Gryffindor needs it?" "If it's returned," Dumbledore said. "That is a question whose answer I will honestly be interested to discover." It was not a reassuring answer. Harry found he respected it for that. In his private office on the dungeon level, Severus Snape felt the dark mark activate at 3:30. It was not the full-strength summons, not the one that made movement involuntary. This was the call of an assembly, the one that said, "Come as soon as you are able," which meant within the hour, which meant now. He pressed his fingers to his forearm without looking at it. He had learned a long time ago that not looking was the only form of control he had over the fact of it, and thought about the timing. Voldemort was gathering the inner circle. The Goblin Council's decision was expected within hours. He would go and listen and bring back everything he heard. He picked up his cloak. He paused at the door of his office, turned back once. On the shelf, beside his desk, there were books he had not removed in 30 years. They had survived 3 changes of address, and 1 period of storage, and the kind of institutional restructuring that was officially called a redecorating and unofficially called a systematic removal of anything that did not fit the new aesthetic. He had kept them anyway. They were bound in a faded blue cloth, and the name on the spines was not his, and he did not take them down. He looked at them for a moment in the way he looked at them sometimes. Without sentimentality, he would have said, and would have been mostly telling the truth. Then he closed the door behind him. Harry was back in the Gryffindor common room by 4 o'clock. Ron and Hermione were in the chairs nearest the fire, which was where they always were when they were waiting for him. He had noticed this pattern before and had never mentioned it, because mentioning it would have required him to think about what it meant, and he wasn't always ready to do that. He sat down. "I'm going to Gringotts with Dumbledore in 3 hours, he said. "You two aren't coming." Ron absorbed this in the way he absorbed things that he objected to, but was not going to argue against. A brief period of stillness, a slight tightening around the jaw, then a release. "Right," he said. Hermione looked at Harry with the expression that meant she had already prepared 3 contingency plans and was deciding which one to hand him. "I know," Harry said before she could start. They sat. The fire crackled steadily. Outside the common room windows, the November light was fading into the early dark of midwinter. the kind of darkness that arrived at 4:30 and felt like an announcement. The castle was warm. It was, Harry thought, one of the warmest places he had ever been, not just temperature, but the specific warmth of a place that held people you trusted. He let himself sit in it for the 3 hours he had. He thought that was probably the right thing to do. They arrived at dusk. Bill was waiting in the public hall as arranged, standing near the bronze doors with his hands in his pockets, and the particular expression of someone who had been there long enough to have composed themselves, but not long enough to relax. When he saw Dumbledore, he straightened. When he saw Harry, he didn't quite manage to keep his eyebrows level. Harry looked back at him. Bill said nothing. They took the cart. The descent through the standard levels was familiar. The rush of cold air, the darkness between the lanterns, the shriek of the rails on the tighter curves. Then the cart stopped at a level Harry had not been to before, and an escort of 2 goblins was waiting, and they walked from there. The corridor was cut by hand through very old stone, the walls unsmooth and unlit by the rail system's lanterns. The goblin escort moved through the dark without any light source Harry could identify. He stayed close to Dumbledore and did not ask questions. He had learned over the past several days to save questions for moments when answers were actually available. The chamber was everything Bill had described and more austere than he had expected. Carved from bedrock, high-ceilinged, in the way of a space that had been made large on purpose, rather than by accident, lit by a blue-white light that came from the stone itself, from fixtures in the walls that gave off no warmth and cast no shadows. 9 goblin counselors sat at a curved table of something that was not wood and not stone, something worked by goblin craft that had the weight of a very old decision. Harry and Bill were directed to seats at the chamber's edge. Dumbledore stood. The head counselor looked at Dumbledore for a long moment. "We were not certain you would come yourself," she said. "I know," Dumbledore said. "I should have come sooner, in other contexts. Coming now is the least of what is required." He did not preamble. He said, "I owe you an acknowledgement before anything else." The Treaty of 1752 was breached by the wizarding institutions of Britain in 1753 and has been in continuous breach ever since. The Sword of Gryffindor was never registered. I have held the position of headmaster of Hogwarts for 37 years and have not corrected this failure. I cannot explain that in a way that reflects well on me, and I do not intend to try. The chamber was very still. One of the 9 counselors, the one to the head counselor's left, glanced briefly at the colleague beside them. It was a small movement. Harry noticed it. "I also need to tell you something about the second object your probes detected," Dumbledore said. "The object in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault. I need to tell you what it is, precisely what it is, because it is directly relevant to the offer that has been made to you by another party. And I believe you deserve to make your decision with accurate information," he told them. He used the word Horcrux, which the goblins did not have, and explained it plainly, a fragment of a living person's soul, severed by deliberate murder and embedded in an object by dark magic. The cup in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault held such a fragment placed there by the man who had made the other party's offer, without the goblin's knowledge or consent, in violation of every principle under which a vault in this institution. He said it directly. The man who placed that fragment in your care without telling you what it was is the same man who is now offering to restore the object. He is offering you recognition, Dumbledore said. What he will do, if he gains your alliance, is use it until it is no longer useful, and then discard you. This is his established pattern. He has never honored a commitment to anyone he did not consider his equal, and he considers no being his equal. The head counselor listens to all of this without expression. When Dumbledore finished, she asked one question. Can what was done to the cup be undone? Yes, Dumbledore said. With the right instruments, I will undertake that restoration as part of any agreement between us. The cup will be returned to its natural state. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned and spoke in gobbledygook to the 8 counselors beside her. The discussion that followed was not 11 minutes. Harry sat at the chamber's edge and watched it, and understood nothing except the broad shape of it, that this was genuine deliberation, not performance, that voices were being raised and lowered in turn, that there were at least 2 clear positions being argued simultaneously. Bill sat beside him without translating. Harry did not ask him to. He had the feeling the translation would be somehow wrong here, that whatever was being decided in that room was being decided in the language it belonged to, and listening to a partial version of it would give him less than the silence did. Above them, in the marble public hall 30 meters overhead, Lucius Malfoy had been in the building for 11 minutes. He had arrived, presented his card, stated his request, urgent audience with the council for a party unnamed, and the clerk had returned from the back corridor and said the council is not available. He had said he would wait. He sat in the chair against the far wall and arranged his expression into the correct configuration. He did not fidget. He did not allow his eyes to move toward the corridor entrance. He knew, from his previous visit, led toward the deeper levels. He kept very far back the thought that the decision was almost certainly being made somewhere below him, that every minute in this chair was a minute in which something was happening he could not influence. He had been trained never to let what he was thinking alter what he appeared to be doing. He waited. In the chamber below, the head counselor turned back to Dumbledore. "You are not the minister," she said. "No," Dumbledore said. "The ministry has, as you know, characterized this crisis as an administrative irregularity. I am not speaking on the ministry's behalf. I am speaking as Albus Dumbledore, as the headmaster who held the sword in his office for 37 years and did not return it, as the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, who has the standing to bring a matter before that body for formal acknowledgement, and as a person who has been wrong before and who knows how to say so in a way that produces something more than words. He set out the structural offer: a joint Goblin Wizard Ward Council, equal standing, to maintain and govern Britain's concealment infrastructure. Goblin Ward Anchor maintenance, formally recognized and compensated. The Sword of Gryffindor returned to Goblin custody immediately. The Hufflepuff Cup restored to its natural state once the fragment within it was destroyed. And a public acknowledgement in the Wizengamot on the record of the treaty breach and the 242 years of non-compliance. "I cannot make this commitment for the ministry," Dumbledore said. "I am making it for myself, and I am telling you that I will ensure the acknowledgement happens because I am in a position to do so, and because it should have happened a very long time ago." The head counselor was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to the council, and they voted. Harry could not read Goblin voting convention. Bill leaned toward him, very slightly, and translated in a voice barely above breath, "Yes, yes, yes, no. Yes, yes, no, yes, no." 7-3. The head counselor turned to Dumbledore. "Provisional negotiation is accepted," she said. "The ward anchors will be partially restored as a gesture of good faith within 48 hours, pending the drafting of a formal treaty instrument." She paused. "The 3 who voted against have entered their dissent in the record." She did not say what the dissent was. She did not say what had nearly happened. She did not need to. Harry looked at the 9 faces. He thought about what it meant that he was here, that the goblins had allowed a 15-year-old to sit in this room and witness this. He thought it probably meant something. He was not entirely sure what yet. Upstairs, a goblin teller clerk crossed the marble floor to where Lucius Malfoy sat and said, in the polite and completely definitive register of a body that had just made a decision, "The council is not available today." His request for an audience was declined. Lucius thanked the clerk. He stood, adjusted his robes, and walked out through the bronze doors into the cold Diagon Alley evening. The street was dark and quiet and smelled of damp stone. He stood on the pavement for a moment. He had been in the right position. He had done everything correctly. Something had happened in the time between his arrival and the clerk's return that had moved the decision the wrong way, and he did not know yet what it was. He would have to report this. For the first time in several days, he was afraid of the conversation. 2 days after the vote, Harry felt the change before he was told about it. He was in the corridor outside the Transfiguration classroom when it happened, a settling, somewhere beneath the castle's usual hum, the subaudible pulse of the building, restabilizing by some fraction that had no name in ordinary language. He stopped walking and stood still for a moment, one hand against the stone wall. The stone felt different under his palm. Not warmer, not smoother, just more present, more itself, as though something that had been slightly wrong for a week had corrected by a measure. The partial ward anchor restoration. Hermione explained it that evening with the precision of someone who had been waiting to explain it. The treaty language was specific. The partial reinstatement was a good faith gesture, formally permitted under the provisional agreement, and it would hold at current levels until a full treaty was signed. The Muggle concealment failures would stop worsening. The damage already done, the photographs, the news items, the Muggle walkers with their wildlife documentation would require weeks more of Obliviator work to address. Full restoration of the outer concealment grid would not happen until new treaty ink was dry. "Not fixed," Hermione said, "but better." "There was a difference," Ron said. "Better is better than not." "That's almost a sentence," Hermione said. The sword left 3 days later. Dumbledore asked Harry to be present, and Bill was already there when Harry arrived, standing near the window of the headmaster's office, with a flat transport case in his hands. Plain wood on the outside, the shimmer of a preservation charm on the interior. The office was quiet. The portraits were awake and watching, but none of them spoke. Dumbledore took the sword from the wall mount himself. He did it without ceremony, but also without hurry, the way you handled something that deserved acknowledgement without performance. The silver blade caught the firelight one last time. The rubies in the hilt were very dark. He held it for a moment, the weight of something that had been in this room longer than anyone alive, and then placed it in the case, and Bill closed the lid. Harry looked at the empty mount on the wall. The stone bracket, the 2 small hooks, the shadow of what had hung there for decades. "Will it still come?" he said. "If someone really needs it, a real Gryffindor, the right kind of need." Dumbledore said, "If it is truly needed by a true Gryffindor, it will find a way. That is its nature." He paused. "I confess I am not entirely certain what the mechanics of that will look like once it is in Goblin custody, but I believe the enchantment is in the sword itself, not in the room where it is kept." He sounded as though he believed this, and was also genuinely, honestly unsure. Harry found this more reassuring than a confident answer would have been. Bill carried the case out. The formal acknowledgement from the Wizengamot came via order relay that evening, a single sheet of paper dense with official language that said in several hundred words what Dumbledore had said to the Goblin Council in fewer. The Treaty of 1752 had been violated by the wizarding institutions of Britain. The violation was documented. The chief warlock had read it into the record. The minister had not spoken the words himself. The statement had been drafted and delivered through the office of the Wizengamot, rather than the minister's office, which was, Hermione said, the most that Fudge would permit, and the minimum that Dumbledore had insisted on. In the ministry galleries that afternoon, Percy Weasley sat in the third row and heard the acknowledgement read aloud, and sat very still. He did not look at the colleagues on either side of him. He thought about a document he had put in his out tray 2 weeks ago, a research summary from the Goblin Liaison Office, marked background reading, not for distribution, and the fact that he had taken it out of the out tray again, and read it, and then not filed it, and then read it once more. He thought about what it meant that he had not filed it. He was not quite ready to think past that point. In the Gryffindor common room that evening, Hermione said, "This is the first time in centuries that the Goblin Nation has sat at a treaty table as a party with equal standing." "Is it still a table if the treaty isn't signed yet?" Ron said. "It is if the framework is equal, which it is this time." Ron thought about this. "Do you think they'll actually sign?" Hermione said. "I think they'll sign if we keep our word." A silence. Harry looked at her. They were both thinking about the same history, the ministry's established relationship with its own commitments, and neither of them said it aloud, because it would have been accurate but not useful, and there were some truths that you held in your chest rather than spoke into a room where people were still hoping. "We should keep our word then," Ron said. "Seems like a plan." The news from Grimmauld Place came through 2 days later, relayed via Dumbledore. Sirius had received Snape's debrief, Snape having reported to Dumbledore after the Inner Circle summons, as he always did, carrying the texture of Voldemort's response in the specific language Snape used for these things, precise, emotionless, and more frightening for both qualities. Voldemort had said nothing when Lucius reported the Council's decision. Not rage. Not punishment. Air. He had been quiet in the way that Snape described as recalculating, the stillness of a chess player who had lost a piece he expected to keep, but who still had the board and who was already 3 moves forward. He knew who the 3 dissenting councillors were. Sirius had told Dumbledore. "He'll try again," Dumbledore had said. "He will try other things. We have a narrow peace with the Goblin Nation. Narrow is better than nothing, and considerably better than the alternative." Sirius had said, "I hate narrow." Dumbledore had said, "Most people do. The trick is not to drop it." Harry read this and thought it was the most accurate description of the next several years of his life he had ever encountered, and that it had been offered by a man who would not be there for all of them, and that he was not going to think about that right now. Bill walked out of Gringotts at dusk. He had delivered the case to Griffook at the handover point the Goblin Council had specified, a side entrance off the main hall away from the banking traffic, which was back to its usual volume now. The partial restoration had helped. The queues were nearly normal. Ian Griffook had not spoken during the handover. Griffook had taken the case and checked the preservation seal and set it on the cart, and that was the work of the thing completed. But before Griffook turned away, he paused. He said in English, "You said we would not receive justice from him. I said you knew what he did, with promises." Bill said, "Yes, we have not yet received justice from you either." Bill did not flinch from this, which was the only honest response available to him. "No," he said, "but we're trying." Griffook looked at him. The sharp black eyes, the absolute assessment. and then he was gone into the tunnels. Bill stood on the Diagon Alley cobblestones in the November dusk, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the cold coming off the stone around him, and he thought about the word, trying not finished. Not fixed, not resolved. 3 goblin councillors had voted the other way, and Voldemort was recalculating, and the new treaty was not written, and the wards were not fully restored, and the cup was still in the vault, and would remain there until arrangements were made, and arrangements had barely begun to be made. But tonight, the worst thing that could have happened did not happen. He had been in the oldest room any wizard had entered in living memory, and he had said the one true thing he had to say, and the goblins had noticed, which was not justice and was not resolution, but was, he thought, the specific thing that made the difference between a door open and a door shut. That was